Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People in Tech. And in this series, we explore the intersection of technology and leadership through the lens of industry experts. And today we're in Manhattan, New York, and I'm delighted to be joined by Bob Matsuoka, who has had many titles over the past years, with some of the most recent ones being CTO of CityMaps and Interim CTO of Tripadvisor. Bob, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, Bob, you've had many titles over your career.
Yes,
you've had quite a substantial career as well.
Yes.
And before we dive into that, I would like to talk a bit about one of the latest companies that you've helped grow and lead,
Sure.
which is Tripadvisor.
Yep.
And a lot of us know Tripadvisor as this fantastic platform for travel and tourism. I personally use it a lot for getting reviews, looking up hotels and restaurants, and for doing bookings as well. But I think there's more to Tripadvisor than meets the eye, because essentially it is a digital technology powerhouse that serves over 400 million unique monthly users.
Correct. Yeah.
And I think last year, the revenue was over 1.5 billion.
In the core business, yes.
In the core business.
Yes.
So this is for a great part been possible off the back of having a substantial engineering team working in the background.
Yeah.
And you've had a big role in building this up and leading this.
Yep.
So maybe you can start by walking us through your career journey.
Sure.
And where you started and how it's led you to where you are today.
Sure. So to be fair, I think the credit for Tripadvisor's success, and it might seem sort of surprising at this time, but really our magic technology was SEO. And Steve Kaufer, our founder, I think really understood at a really early time that driving traffic and controlling traffic was the key to successfully growing a business, especially in a certain space when you had the content to map the space. So obviously, ostensibly, Tripadvisor is about reviews and information about hotels and things like that. But what Steve did was really he pioneered a lot of the technologies. Fortunately, most of those technologies, they're a bit intrusive. So flyovers, popovers, pop-unders, those kind of things, that's done. But he really understood how to build a team that would drive traffic to the site. And that's largely the reason why I think Tripadvisor succeeded in getting the audience that it did, was that if you were looking for anything on travel anywhere, Tripadvisor was always one of the top results.
Yeah.
And I think that grew into both the content, but then also trust. We have actually an incredible trust and safety team. That's one of the teams that I managed early on the game.
Right.
And I think of all the review content that's out there, Tripadvisor is probably the best curated, the most reliable, and in a lot of ways, still the typical usage pattern is you'll go to wherever you go, your favorite boutique hotel site or whatever, you'll look at this thing and then you say, well, do I really trust that this is good? And you go to Tripadvisor and say, oh, let's check it out.
Yeah,
and
it's like the source of truth for all of us users.
It is. And still is. And I think the key, for the Tripadvisor's future is to play on that trust and that relationship with the audience. Obviously, audiences are changing, and I think Tripadvisor, their challenge is to sort of figure out how do you take that goodwill and that traffic and the history and the brand is very well known, and turn that into sort of the usage patterns of the future. And I'm not sure how much you know, but travel these days is really all social, right? People, when you ask anybody who's under 40, where they look for information about a restaurant or a hotel, whatever they say, well, I go on TikTok or I go on Instagram.
And socials.
So that's all, and there's a company that's starting an entire at hotel that's starting a business just doing social OTA. He has an OTA built entirely around Instagram. So that's one strategy. And so Tripadvisor is three businesses.
Right.
The core business is the one that is most famous as the Tripadvisor brand. It's the one that shows the hotels and the reviews and things like that. There's also the Fork, which is essentially Open Table of Europe.
I've used it quite a few times. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. And then finally, there's Viator. And Viator is part of the fastest growing segment of travel right now is in experiences. And so there's a generational shift going on. In addition to usage patterns, it's the generations really think about travel in different ways.
Right.
I'll say my generation, it was really about traveling to a nice place, to a hotel. These days, it's about experiences.
Yeah.
And actually, people travel in different ways. They don't just want to stay in a hotel. They have rentals, they have group travel, all those kind of things. But more importantly, they really want to have the memory of what they did when they were there.
Yeah.
And so that area with Viator and Get Your Guide is really exploding. And unlike the hotels business and the airlines business and the car rentals business, which are very well established, the experiences business is still wide open.
Yeah, my generation tends to kind of move away from the all-inclusive packages that hotels offer.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there's actually interesting, there's a lot of new types of travel, like adventure travel is a big thing. So you are doing travel with groups, but it's not your conventional, go and stay. It's go and hike, really kind of cool things that are going on. So I think the travel space is very healthy. And I'd like to say that, even though the model of travel is changing, I think the stuff that's coming down the pike is actually just as interesting or even more interesting than what was there.
Yeah.
So I think TripAdvisor's, for the company now, since I've left TripAdvisor, the key is really figuring out how to make the trust and the brand relevant in this new era with different audiences and different forms of discovery and so on.
And that's amazing. And just taking one step back, before TripAdvisor, you were also leading engineering teams, let's say, in startups.
Yes.
So my question is, when you look at the way you and the challenges you face leading engineering teams at startups, which are a bit more fast-paced, a bit more dynamic, to moving into a more, let's say, structured environment of a bigger organization.
Right.
What are some of the key differences that you noticed, and how has your approach to leading teams evolved over the years?
So they really couldn't be more different. And I'll say with a bit of hubris, when I had a bit of hubris coming into it. So I had my own startup in the late 90s. We grew to roughly 50 or so headcount engineers. And then the company went, one of the lessons I learned from my own startup days is fail fast, right? I spent probably way too long at the company, and it succeeded, but not to the extent where it was worth the time and effort I was putting into it.
How many years were you there for?
So I think I was there a total of 8 years.
8 years.
And it should have been less than 5.
Right.
And so I really kind of burned myself out and went out. But I did love, I think my favorite activity in all of engineering really is the process, the building, taking the ideas and the business opportunity and turning that into engineering. That's what I love. I think the connection between engineering and business value is still, in fact, maybe more relevant now, and that's what I always really enjoyed. But so when I left, I spent a lot of time doing fractional work in the city.
Yeah.
And generally, what I would do is take some cash, take some equity, invest my own time in ideas and companies and people that I thought had potential and were really interesting. And one of them was a company called CityMaps. And interestingly enough, I was in grad school working at a private school on the Upper East Side, the Dalton School.
Right.
And we ran a technology program called the New Laboratory for Teaching and Learning. A lot of incredible ideas and companies and people came out of that group. And two of the students that were there at the time, though I didn't know them, had founded a company called CityMaps. And one of my connections in the city who does consulting was too busy to take them on and said, hey, would you be interested in talking to these guys? And I said, yes. They had great ideas, great energy. And I think one of the things also you look for in founders is what sort of strategic value are they bringing? It can't be just the ideas. Everybody has ideas. It's always about execution. And they really were connected. They both were operationally good. One of the partners was a very strong operator, really good dynamic leader. In fact, he's running another technology program now. Another one was really good at connecting to the fundraising community. They were good at fundraising. And so I was like, oh yeah, I'll give it a shot. And very quickly, we had, I think the time I joined, there were 2 engineers. We grew to 25. We went through multiple rounds of fundraising.
From 2 to 25?
Yes, I think so. I started as a consultant in 2010, came on more or less full-time-ish in 2011.
Okay.
And then in 2016, we were acquired by TripAdvisor. So that was quite a run. And I'll tell you, those 5 years, 6 years, we still are very close to a lot of the team, the original team we're very close to. In fact, this summer, I went to a wedding in Burgundy in France of one of the young men who was on that team. And I think we had 4 or 5 other people from both TripAdvisor and CityMaps at the wedding. So we stay very close. It was an incredible time. We had an office on Madison Avenue in a brownstone. Essentially, it was a floor through a brownstone. We would go out and play football in Central Park. It was an incredible energy, and in a lot of ways, I think that feeling of sort of really you move very fast. The energy, the dynamism, the sense of excitement is really what drives the success. And so when we had the offer to be acquired, a lot of, part of me was like, well, do I want to do this? I'd actually just started up another company with my partner and a few other people.
Yeah.
And then she was like, wait, you got a chance to take a corporate job? Don't be foolish, take it. And so I did, and I wasn't sure I would like it. Turns out I loved it. And it was a very different kind of skill set.
Yeah.
A lot of it was also meeting people. As a fractional consultant and a sort of running your own company, I tend to sort of not want to get involved in more of the sell side and the operations side. But turns out those are important skills to have too. And early enough, soon on, I sort of learned that I really could be good at it. I love the people at Tripadvisor. Still some of the best people I've ever worked with.
Yeah.
Really good people, not a lot of ego. And I think one of the crazy things, well, I'll tell you that before going into it, I sort of, you apply for jobs and they ask you sort of what your experience was. And I think the biggest team until that point I'd run was my own team. My startup was running around 50 people. And so my hubristic attitude was, well, it's just double or triple that number. No, it's very different. And I learned quickly that it's not really about the size. The size is important, but it's really about impact and how you impact people and how you impact the organization. And so I think it took me a couple of years, a few years to sort of understand how the culture worked. And one of the things I started doing was I realized that, so Tripadvisor has we have a headquarters, or they have a headquarters in Needham, Massachusetts. It's a building that holds 700-800 people, I believe, 6 floors.
Yeah, quite big.
Pretty big. And now it's not being used quite as much as it was then, but it was really where all the energy and the activity of the company was. And so we had an office in New York City where we were, my CityMaps team was based, but I would make the point of going up to Needham once I sort of understood that just walking the halls and meeting people and making connections and making cross-functional connections was really important. I spent a lot of time going up there and just working from there because even, obviously there's always a meeting to do or something to get done, but even more importantly, just getting to know the people there was really important.
Yeah.
And actually one of the things, I moved into an operations role when I joined, the engineering org was really divided into business units. So every pillar, the hotels team, the flights team, flights, rentals, cars, experiences, each had their own engineering team that rolled up into the president of the division. And so there was a CTO office, but it was more almost like a consulting office, right? Sort of like a brain trust. And which is fine, but there wasn't a whole lot of efficiency in running a big org. So in 2018, my former boss, Sugata, took over the entire engineering org and consolidated into what we call Global Engineering and Technology, GET.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I sort of observed was that it really needed operations support, right? It's one thing to sort of say, well, we're consolidating. Well, to get the efficiencies of the consolidation, you have to operate efficiently. And so I spent a lot of time with him and with cross-functional teams. I spent a lot of time with the FP&A group, with HR, and I built a process for really tracking the activity, the working of the various engineering teams. And I think in a lot of ways, my career path at Trip was not just purely engineering. I mean, don't get me wrong, like anybody else, I love architecture, I like engineering design, I like coding.
Yeah.
But you sort of figure out what skills are important and what are the levers that are going to get you to the next step. Initially, I think one of the reasons I went up to Trip was that we were doing a relaunch of the app. And a lot of the engineering models that were used to build the social network in the app were things that we'd done at CityMaps.
Right.
So I went up there with the design teams to sort of talk about some of the ways that we did it. Obviously there are graph databases now that are very powerful. They weren't quite so powerful or accessible back then. And so we sort of faked it using conventional databases and so on. So that was my kind of role there. But when I moved to operations, it really was less about pure, I ran a couple of engineering teams. I ran, as I said, the trust and safety team, a few others. But I also really focused on making the engineering spend, it was a large budget. We spent over $100 million on engineering technology, and understanding how those dollars were being used, what the levers, what what the impact was on the various aspects of business was something that nobody had really ever done at a granular level from the top down. And so
it's a whole different dynamic now.
Whole
because
different
you
dynamic.
move from the actual implementation
Yes.
and the tech stack and whatnot to more of, how do I allocate resources to...
It's all about allocation. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm sick of that word, but honestly, I did feel there was a value in it. And honestly, it's not just, there's kind of a, are we just counting beans? But it's really not, because I think there's two things. One is, from the business's perspective, they need to get the maximum value from the dollars they're spending. And as a public company, you spend a lot of money on engineering, right? The flip side, though, is even from the engineering perspective, I think every engineer wants to feel that his work, it's a very personal relationship with your code. And you want to feel like that work is meaningful. And so the more connected you can make that work to the outcomes in the business, I think the more rewarding the engineering is. I mean, there's a lot of engineering work that's more theoretical, hypothetical, not necessarily tied to business outcome, which is fine.
Yeah.
There are roles for that, but I think in a commercial company, in a commercial institution, it really is tied to the value of the work that you're doing in business.
And on that point, you mentioned various engineering teams, and Tripadvisor is obviously a massive platform with millions of users, and I believe you've also helped expand teams across multiple geographies.
Right.
So what are some of the challenges that you faced when being in charge and leading large-scale engineering operations and dealing with managing teams across different geographies? I believe some of them were across the US and also across Europe.
Yeah, we had several locations overseas, I think at a peak around 30 or so. So I'll say there's two things. One is, it's not just about globalizing the workforce, which I had a pretty key role in, but it was also really about changing the attitude toward hiring. So one of my early experiences at Trip was I sat in on an interview where we were one of the principal engineers was interviewing a candidate for the app team, I believe. And I thought the candidate presented himself very well, but he was a non-traditional candidate. So he hadn't gone to MIT or RPI or Tufts, so one of the sort of the traditional engineering schools that Trip likes to hire from. But he had a lot of he understood the ecosystem of engineering very well, but maybe not quite as solid on sort of the core foundational principles. In my mind, I think you need both, right? You need engineers who understand engineering, the core technology, the core programming and data structures and everything as much as anything else. But you also have to understand where the world is going as far as engineering goes. And I think one of the problems at Trip is that they had built an incredible team designed to do a set of very important specific things at a very high volume and pace. But it was really, they were building something that was very hard to scale beyond the core team and also hard to adapt. So we actually still have they still have a massive legacy challenge tied to the approach of the engineering team to build everything themselves. It was definitely a build it first shop. And I think in the course of working at Trip, I've kind of flipped my attitude is build it last. And then there's I think a philosophy now where the tide of engineering platforms has risen so high. Look at a company like Vercel, right? Vercel has really taken a lot of the operational mechanics of the front end and essentially made it plug and play. And in the sense that the cloud is sort of core hosting plug and play, Vercel is trying to do that with the whole front end infrastructure, right? And so you don't really need the ops support you do if you're a small company and you want to really focus on outcomes and not infrastructure. Vercel is a great solution, right? It's more expensive than pure AWS hosting or one of these other cloud providers, but what you're getting is not just the capacity, you're also getting the management. And so at Tripadvisor, I think because they had so many strong engineers, their typical the engineering answer to everything was, we'll code it. I'll tell you a quick story.
Kind of build it from scratch.
Build it from scratch. So so my startup was a CMS builder. And so I knew a lot about CMSs, and one of the observations I'd made back before, a few years after I started working there, was I was going through our Confluence, where we stored the documentation of all the projects we were doing, looking for a solution to manage some content, and I saw, hey, somebody's building a CMS, and why is somebody building a CMS in 2018 or 17, whatever it was? And then I kept looking, and I found another one, and I said, hey, this is somebody building another, essentially a CMS. And so I went to the CTO at that time, and I said to Nick, people are actually trying to build out CMSs in our code. And he said, no, they're not doing that. I said, I'll bet you that that if you give me an hour to go poke around in our Confluence, I'll come back with 5 examples of various, implementations of CMSs. They said, sure, go ahead. And I think we bet something on it. And so I came back in a half an hour with 10 examples.
Wow. 10 examples.
10 examples.
Oh, man.
And actually, I'm happy to say this year we went to Contentful, headless CMS, great headless CMS at Tripadvisor for the first time, and actually it's driving parts of the site. And so, again, I think it's a mindset attitude. And so it's not just globalizing. I think the great thing about globalizing is that you'll find that there's great engineering talent everywhere. And obviously it costs as a factor to it, but it's not just about that. It is really good engineering culture. And I think as a global travel company with perspectives that really span the globe, we should have different perspectives. And so in addition to sort of this hiring practices and not just hiring, locally, I did a lot of work on moving our teams we have teams in Eastern Europe. We have an incredible team in Croatia. We have teams in Oxford, big team in Canada. And so, I think when I started at Tripadvisor, we were 90% full-time in the Northeast. And COVID also, of course, caused a lot of problems with hiring and sort of workforce. And so we actually had a big layoff just right after COVID. We had to hire back because travel grew back almost as
No one knew what was happening during COVID.
Nobody knew what was happening, but it grew back very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And so I think earlier this year, we were probably 40% full-time in the US, and not just in the Northeast because we had kind of a COVID flight, so people moved out to various other second cities in the country.
Yeah.
But we also had probably another 50% that were overseas, and then probably 30% that were contractor. And now
30%.
30%. Yeah. Which I think is, as a long-term solution, is probably higher than healthy.
Yeah.
But contractors, again, there's a lot more flexibility you have with them. You're able to sort of move them and task them in different ways that you can't necessarily with full-time people. And so I think one of the plans we had a big people resources plan at the end of last year, and that really called for drawing down the contractor force a little bit in favor of full-time people. We set up 2 new full-time offices. I think the first 2 new we've ever had engineering-wise, one in Romania, one in Croatia, as I mentioned. And so we're leaning more into those as full-time employees in order to balance it.
Yeah.
And then to your point about time zones and offsets, yes, it was a big challenge. Definitely a work in progress.
Yeah.
One of the things we tried to do was include the GMT offset of every employee in our kind of master database and focus on trying to keep the total offsets to under 4 or 5 hours because under 4 or 5 hours, you can still do a stand up in the morning,
catch up,
exactly.
Yeah.
And
So
generally, you find that Eastern, so I think you end up with zones, right? So India is a problem in any way. So the only way India works, in my mind, is that you have full, business engineering cycles available locally. So you have PMs and business leads there. They don't have to work synchronously. They can work independently, and then obviously they'll synchronize or coordinate and check in offline. With Eastern Europe and the Eastern United States, that's one kind of zone they can work. There's a 4 or 5 hour, depending on the daylight time offset, which is manageable. And then between Eastern U.S. and Western U.S., you can also manage that. And we also had a team, a substantial team in Latin America as well. That obviously that lines up well. So between Latin America, U.S. as a whole, and then Canada, that was essentially one time zone. And then we had sort of Eastern Europe and the Eastern U.S. as another time zone, and for us, kind of a management zone, and then obviously India was off its zone.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. And we talked a bit about management. I'd also like to include something else that's important, which is leadership into the conversation. Yeah. Now, a lot of people still confuse leadership with management. And I mentioned this in the last episode that I did. But again, for our audience, management is more about the day-to-day. It's about creating processes and structures and executing in a timely manner. Right. Whereas leadership, on the other hand, is about fostering a culture that is aligned with the company's long-term vision. It's about inspiring people. It's about innovation and guiding people towards a shared vision. Yeah. Now, in a company like Tripadvisor, which is a big company, I can imagine both are needed. So how do you go about switching between different roles? And are there times that you lean more into leadership and other times that call more for, let's say, strong management?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'd say I had help because I had a few good examples of very strong leaders at Trip. And I mentioned Steve Kaufer, the founder, great leader, hugely loved and respected in the company, always out there, believed in what he did, believed in the company, and really led by example. I also had Sugata, who was my boss, who was the CTO from 2018 till 2023.
Okay.
And really good at, I think he was a great leader in terms of sort of taking a vision for where engineering was going to go. In fact, I think he, in a lot of ways, really set the blueprint for the future structure of engineering at Trip, as compared to what it was when he took over.
Right.
From my perspective, I've never been that comfortable with the notion of leadership. I don't necessarily consider myself a great leader, but I do think I'm passionate about what I do. I think my approach has really been two things, really. One is to lean into every aspect of what we do. And so one of the things that I really made an attempt to do was to stay current on everything that was going on in the org. So I think until at 2023, I took over the head of all product engineering. So we essentially had in Tripadvisor Core, we had two kind of major groups. We had platform engineering and IT, and then product engineering. And so product engineering really, it covers all aspects of the hotels and the experiences and the flights and cars and rentals and the B2B business. And so for my solution was, and this is very typical. I guess I tend to be a bit of a wonk, but I really wanted to not only be familiar on myself with with what's going on as far as the engineering activities, but also I wanted to bring the rest of the company along. I felt like we really, after COVID especially.
Yeah.
So as of last year, the median tenure of an employee at Tripadvisor was less than 2 years, and that was because of COVID, because it was obviously a massive shift, and a lot of new people came in the door, and so we had two challenges. One is that the old culture of being in headquarters and making the rounds and knowing the people there was gone. And actually, for most of 23, I think if we had 100 people in that building, it was a good day. And I actually have the numbers.
Space for how many in the building?
700, I think, at least. There was a time in 2016 when Lindsay Nelson, who was the head of B2C at the time, wanted us, all the engineers on her group, on one floor. And so we literally had no space to put people. We had to start consolidating carrels. It was kind of a mess. But after COVID, we shut down two floors. We leased out 2 floors, and then we occupied the first. Shut down 1, leased out 2, and then we occupied the first 3 floors. And even then, again, there were days when there were 30, 40, 50 people in the office. Crazy. Yeah. And so we had this challenge of, well, how do you recreate sort of the water cooler culture? How do you get people to understand what they're working on, what other people are working on, and so on? And the second is how do people get to meet other people?
Yeah,
right. That's a challenge, right? So
we have hardly teams anyone coming into the office.
So I did 2 things. One is I set up a newsletter, and it sounds maybe a bit trite, but actually it was a fairly detailed. But I had all of the directors and the technical managers really submit their own projects. They had a spreadsheet where they would put in on a monthly basis what they were working on, the various, the Jira tickets that's tied to any sort of collateral in terms of specs or screenshots or any demos. And then I'll write a little kind of blurb. Hey, this is what we're going, milestones. We really look for milestones, achievements, things like that. There's we have things called revenue wins. When Tripadvisor has so much traffic, if you change the color of a button or shift it, oftentimes we call it RevOps. You can actually make tens of thousands of dollars, on a month on something as small as that or more. But those were wins that were, that I thought were worth celebrating. And so I did that. And the second is I went back to, we used to have a demo at headquarters that was in a single conference room, but it was usually overflowed to a couple of others, and we'd use the video system to connect them. And so obviously we couldn't do that because we were all over the world and people weren't at headquarters. But I kind of brought back that demo. And for me, they're important enough that for most of the time I was there and I was running it, I did that myself. I fortunately had somebody come in to help me with it later on, and that sort of saved it because it was a lot of work. But I think 2 things came about. One is that I like to put in my sort of own voice to the newsletters, like just add a little bit of, trivia or sort of news or just my perspective. And so I think from my perspective, leadership is not just being a figurehead, being a person that people look to, but also a person that people can connect to. So in the sense that I would also do a lot of skip level meetings. I would try, when I think my org was 100 people, I had a goal of having a one-on-one meeting with every single person in that org, and I think I got there.
Wow,
it was hard.
That's a big number, like 100 people.
Except that they kept growing the org, so I couldn't keep up with it. So I gave up, but I did keep trying to do those things. But if I couldn't do it in person, then certainly in terms of a publication, right, you can express a voice, and that was one.
Yeah, you can reach out to a larger number of people on a regular basis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the second is that I also personally ran the demos, and so those were initially they were once a month, but then initially, when we started doing it, there wasn't as much enthusiasm for it. People had forgotten about it, and so I had to do a lot of extolling and
people like, hey,
come on. But by the time I left, I think we'd moved to every 2 weeks, and again, I ran those myself. I loved them. That was I think the highlight of my month were the demos, just seeing the people doing them. Because first of all, there's clearly passion in what they're doing. The people who are willing to do the demos often are the most passionate people in the company anyway. And so both those things really were a way to sort of recreate the culture. And I think I had a meeting in 23. I went up to Canada. The other thing I'd like to try to do is hold town halls in the locations where people were. So I ran one from Canada.
And you had multiple locations, so that's a bit of moving around sometimes,
And we had a town hall from Canada. And one of my, I think, messages there was that the future of culture is going to be around what we call rituals, right? Okay. That the rituals, rituals are there anyway, but they're easier to see in a physical space. They're not so easy to see in a virtual space. And so I think the newsletter and the monthly demos were two examples, and there are other ones, of consistent rituals that we added importance to, and I personally took a very big interest in managing. And the idea behind them really was about sort of, hey, there's this company now, you are one of, and when I was running as Interim, there was 550 people in the org. We were one of 550 people doing various kinds of things, and they're all important. One of the things I heard from the IT people is like, hey, we're not getting in love. We do a lot of work and nobody knows. And so I think, all those things were important. And so I made a big sort of strong effort to call out the projects that were going on, the successes they made, and who are the people that were doing it.
Who are the people behind the work?
There was a lot of people that often don't get, like, we had a lot of like back-end tools, a lot of management tools, and they really make a big difference. Like our hotels team, for example, had to run they had a tool to manage the pricing and things like that. There was an issue with one of them. One of the engineers spent weeks trying to dig down to figure out why we're getting this discrepancy in the revenue we're recording, and that was a huge thing. And again, I felt like that's the kind of thing we need to celebrate all the time. And so
keep everyone included as well, and everyone gets the recognition that they deserve.
Yeah, and so I think in the same sense that a small team, an engineering team, will have stand-ups, and that's their ritual. They have stand-up every day, and they may have milestone or whatever check-in meetings on a regular basis.
Yeah.
In my mind, that obviously with a big org you can't do it quite as often, but having biweekly routines and rituals and monthly rituals and being consistent about them, and I think we ended up when I left, I think I'd published probably 20 different newsletters and obviously the demos, and I think that kind of cadence brings consistency, brings predictability, and those are important things for people. They want to understand,
It's amazing you've been able to do that in a big organization.
I had help. I had my assistant Andrea, who came on to help, was just changed my life because
Andrea's great. Andrea's great. Yes. I communicated with her a few times. Now, moving on to a slightly different topic that is a bit more strategic. Now, this is a question that's going to be a bit more risky for us because of the nature of our business. And you'll understand why in a sec. But essentially, I just want your honest feedback on this topic. So we get a lot of companies and people approach us and be like, hey, Gabe, or hey, Daydevs, can you help us build out this product or this feature? And some people, they face the question of, should I hire in-house to build out this product? Or Should I seek the help of external experts or outsource the whole project or part of the project? We also work with larger corporations who have their own teams, and we help them on some specific technical tasks or on high demand projects where they just need more hands on deck. So, Bob, in your experience, is there a time when it makes more sense to work with external teams than to outsource? And what are some of the key aspects that companies need to take into consideration when thinking about keeping everything in-house or also working with external teams?
That's a great question. And in fact, one of the things that happened when I exited Trip was I reconnected with my networks, spent a lot of time going to events and just talking to people. And I think now with AI more than ever, and there's a lot of uncertainty on what's happening, but I think we are seeing a pretty seminal shift in what engineering means to the business. And I'd even go out as far to say that unless you expect to be a business in the hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, you probably don't want to have your own internal team. Now, here's what I mean by that. Good engineering is not just hiring a contractor or a full-time employee. There's a culture, there's a growth path, and even more so now because the difference between a good engineer and an average engineer is actually average engineers, their jobs are likely going to be diminished or replaced. You know, I don't know if you've seen V0, a very cool product that Vercel just put out, and other companies are doing the same kind of thing, where they will just look at a website and they will componentize it and rebuild it in React. Right now, this is obviously UX stuff or UI stuff. It's not for everything. But the first question, I think 2 years ago when we were getting in the AI path, I think I was asked by leadership is, well, when do we see the savings? And of course, you know what that means, right? The savings are when can we start, hiring less engineers? But I think even more importantly, there is a role for engineering has to be strategic. In fact, actually, I think one of the mantras I had was every hire is strategic. If you're not hiring because it actually is adding a capacity that you couldn't get otherwise, then you shouldn't be hiring. And so it's been interesting. One of the things that's come out of the networking I've done over the past few months is that I've seen more and more, probably at least 4 examples of companies where they were better off. It was either they were small and they just had to maintain a stack, or there was a lot of VC to, I call it VC to PE shift. So the VCs put a ton of money in, got it to a certain point, they were a certain size, and the company made money, obviously, or it wouldn't be out of business, but it wasn't making enough money. And so the PE, it was sold to PEs. They came in and said, no, well, that's fine. You're making money, but you have way too big an engineering headcount to be profitable. So how do we make it profitable? And so they were shifting down, and they shifted down to the point where it was hard to maintain a quality engineering team based on the size of the org that they had. And so one of the things is that engineering does require you have to build a framework around hiring, training, progressing, new technologies, new things that are available in the stack. And if you aren't being led, if you aren't essentially an engineering only company, you're essentially a business first company, it's very hard to find the skill set to manage that in-house. And so I've talked to a few people about sort of the idea of I don't want to call it outsource, but it's the contracted engineering capacity, right? And the idea is not that you are just hiring bodies, but you're hiring a capacity. So the idea is that you have a strategic alignment that's probably not an engineer, and that's probably some sort of person in operations, or maybe even a PM, or somebody who is essentially representing the business interests, right? On the functionality and budget side, mapping dollars to functionality. And then you need to also then map that to a firm, potentially like yours, that will maintain it over a long term. So this is I think where it's different, right? Most of the time, certainly for me, when we were recovering from COVID, one of the benefits of a contracting force is that, we're doing short-term hires and we can sort of shift things around, and that's fine. But this is not what this is. That is not what this is. What I'm thinking about now is a long-term contract. In fact, I think they only work if you sign, either multi-quarter or multi-year contracts. And the role of this company is 2 things. One is to guarantee continuity and stability in the technical stack. So you're actually managing that roadmap. Now, you don't even have to define the roadmap. That can be done at a business level.
But you are managing it.
You have to execute it and manage it. You're managing the pieces. And it's also easier to do now because more and more, like even AWS is thought of as kind of, raw metal in some sense, right? Nobody actually runs. Well, few people. If you have the internal expertise, you can do it. But if you don't, you'll end up, spending a whole lot of money that you don't need to. And more companies like Vercel and others are putting a layer on top of the cloud that makes it easier to manage. And it still requires technical expertise, but it doesn't mean that you have to have that yourself.
Right.
So the idea is that you have a relationship with the company, and again, it's a contractual relationship, and it can change, but it's designed to work over a certain period of time.
Yeah.
And then the issues of technology choice and hiring and training and career progression are not in your hands, they're in that company's. They're taken care of.
It sounds more like kind of like a partnership.
Yes.
In a sense.
So there actually are analogies in the other spaces for lawyers, for example, legal firms, accountants, right? We've decided at this point that it's rare that you might have an internal accountant, but anything complicated, they'll go out to an accounting firm, they'll manage it for them. Same with law, these other things.
Yeah.
I actually think that's the case. And you'll have either, most likely there'll be somebody more like a technical PM or something like that.
Yeah.
Internally representing your interests, and they will report to the CEO or the COO, whoever's in charge of the technical product feature set. But they will be working with a firm to manage it. And I believe that especially as AI makes a lot of these things easier to operate, but also in some sense, you have to understand what you're doing with it. I think this model will become, especially for smaller companies, more and more prevalent.
Yeah. And in your experience, what do you think companies like ours who are doing these partnerships, what externals could be doing better? Like, do you feel like there are some things that could be improved on in order to make this experience a lot more seamless and a lot more long term, as you were talking about? Yeah.
So I think what I would encourage is think outside the box in terms of contracts, right? I hear from contracting firms all the time. Like, I've got engineers that are cheap and whatever. I'd say that's fine. I would stay out of that business. It's especially now it's less and less, I think, has legs in terms of the future. I think it's more about looking at how companies, what's the strategic value or strategic role of engineering with companies, and how do they manage it long term? And so if you align yourself to their interests and build a relationship, and it really is in a lot of ways about contractual relationships. I mean, I'll give you another example. There's a company called Comwork, based out of India.
Yeah.
That has started a new model, a different model. This is not quite the same as this one, but it's very interesting. And it's called the EOR model. And so the EOR model is called the employer of record model, where the contracting company is essentially the employer from a legal perspective.
Yeah.
But they're providing an outsourced recruiting, HR, and sort of people operations facility, but the people they hire slot into yours.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, part of the main company.
Part of the main company.
Yeah.
And it works well, and not every country you can't do that necessarily in the United States. It depends on the culture of the companies. Countries. Certainly India, I think, is very flexible with that kind of stuff. And so the value there is that it's the traditional model of outsourced engineering is you're doing a high markup, 40, 50, 60% of the cost of the engineer goes to the agency. And there was a time when that made sense. I think it makes less sense now. Yeah. And obviously it's a factor in the company's own strategic interest. So if I'm a Tripadvisor, for example, and I find out, okay, well, I have the capacity to manage engineers and I can do it remotely myself, then why would I go with somebody else unless I want that flexibility? And so but with something like an EOR model, then, and I don't have a presence, for example, in India, it allows me to sort of take advantage of that market without doing a lot of the work to set it up.
It takes away all like the pain points of, as you said, going through the process of hiring people and whatnot, but the talent still is able to stay as a core part of your business.
Yeah, so I really think that those three models, internal, sort of traditional internal hiring, the sort of the outsourced capacity, engineering capacity, and the EOR, and maybe some combination of the two.
Yeah, it's more of a tailored approach.
Yeah, the more value-added approach. I think the idea of trying to compete just on pure price, it's fine. I'm not saying people won't do it, but I think from both sides, from the perspective of the suppliers, you're not really adding a whole lot of value unless you are really building that sort of hiring culture and the growth culture for the companies. And
Yeah.
frankly, it's also, it's a people business. It's kind of like you're a body shop, and that's fine. But I think there are more interesting things to do as far as engineering goes. And the flip side is, it also is a message to the hirers. Don't just look at the cost of the body, but the overall picture of what is your engineering costing you long term. And if you're not building something that's quality and strategic and of value, then is that the right way to build it just by finding the cheapest people to?
That is very
against it?
insightful. Thank you for that. That's super insightful. Now, before we move on to some of your future adventures,
Sure.
I would like to just take a moment to reflect on your remarkable career. And looking back, what would you say are some of your proudest moments? And on the flip side of that, what would you say were some of the most difficult moments or some of the failures that shape the way you do things now?
Yeah. Well, going all the way back, definitely spending too much time at my own startup. I think there's a pride and maybe a stubbornness when you do your own thing, is to focus on, I think there's the tendency of engineers is to try to solve problems by building things. And maybe to spend too much time focusing on building versus, hey, stepping back and looking at the big picture and saying, am I building the right thing? Is it the right time in the market?
Yeah.
Are people, am I getting reinforcement from the market for the kind of thing I'm building? And so I definitely stayed at least 4 or 5 years too long in the company. And so I think that had it was a tough time in a lot of ways. It was also, there was a 2001 crash. There was obviously 9/11, a lot of things going on. And so
that all happened
all at the same time.
And
we also had the blackout. It was just a crazy time.
Wow.
It was a fun time in a lot of ways. The late 90s were definitely fun. The early 2000s were very tough.
Sail through that storm.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think the lesson there, is about sort of, being able to step back and I think for your health, there were a lot of nights. I think in my first startup, I had a routine habit of doing an all-nighter once a week just because I just felt like I had to contribute. And a lot of that was just stupid stuff. It was coding. I coded probably 80% of our core product. And just being able to let go of that and saying, no, actually, I'm not solving a problem by coding.
Yeah.
I'm really solving a problem by figuring out where the business is going. And if I had taken that approach, I think I would have. It was also a bit of confidence. I just, I didn't know what I had this. So I had the obligations. I had my, I did a friends and family round, and so I kind of felt that I couldn't let go. But the fact is that in hindsight, I think nobody blamed me for my choices that I made, and I could have made them sooner with the same result.
Yeah.
In terms of success, I'd say CityMaps. That was a great time, and I think taking the company and packaging it for sale and doing the meetings and having it acquired was a great success.
It was acquired by Tripadvisor.
By Tripadvisor, yes. And there's a lot of things technology-wise. The engineering team, incredible. Building a map engine that could fit on your phone or fit on the server.
Yeah.
Incredible. Adam and Eddie and Pavel, three on sort of the different parts of it, the UI piece and the core engineering and the ops piece. Great engineers. Still doing Adam and Pavel are still at Tripadvisor. Eddie is at GoPuff.
Yeah.
So that was really, I think, a real great success. I think, Tripadvisor, there were tough times. I think obviously the pandemic was really hard. The impact on the workforce.
Yeah.
But I think then, building the core, the global engineering team, and I think partially also myself going from one of the things that when I first started taking over a section of the B2C engineering team.
Yeah.
One of the common comments was, "Who's this guy?" I mean, some people knew me. I had a core constituency, but a lot of the engineers didn't know me, and so I really made a really concerted effort to get to know as many people as I could.
Yeah.
And I think that made my growth, made it both more palatable to the company, but also to the teams, to say, "Oh yeah, this is the guy who's going to be leading us." And I think that was, a personal transition for me. I had also a coach at the time, and he really talked me through a lot of things in terms of how to manage and how to manage large orgs. And as I said, I think I had a very naive idea that managing a bigger org is just managing smaller orgs many times, but it's not. The way you work changes quite a bit.
It's quite different.
Quite different. Yeah. And I think as we were talking before, one of the things that I'm enjoying now is going back to small teams. I think I'm fortunate and I'm privileged. Obviously, when you work for a big company, you have more flexibility and the pay is good. And when you exit, you have packages and things like that. And so I think for the first time, I've had time to sort of, I think in the first time in 15 years, I've had a chance to sort of take a stock of where I am and make some choices. And having been in this environment, this sort of leadership environment, it's great, and I may go back to it, but I'm really enjoying exploring different options. And in fact, I did have a chance to go back to work for another big company, but I think I will, at least for now, stay with some of the smaller companies that I'm working with, and I'm having a lot of fun.
And on that point, congratulations, first of all, for this amazing career that you've had so far. But it's not over yet, because on that point, you are now embarking on a new adventure, venturing back into the unknown, and back into the dynamic, unknown world of startups. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So I'm doing some fractional consulting, and so I have a couple different clients that I'm spending sort of a certain amount of time a week with. But I also, this is, and in fact, somebody else was asking me about this, about sort of, well, how do you navigate sort of the uncertainty, or how do you read the trends? I can't say that reading technology trends has really been a great benefit in terms of sort of career and at least career change, right? I think the trends happen, but at the end of the day, it's money and people that sort of turn them into actual businesses and things like that. It is, I think, really important to stay abreast of, like when AI was clearly a big thing, even before it is the big thing that it is now. I really wanted us to lean into AI, and I think we did some things. I think we could have done a lot more. But I will say that one of the things that I think has been really valuable is that, especially over the past couple of years, I've kind of reached out. I started spending a lot of time with vendors. I think, again, one of the things that I think I brought to Trip, which I think wasn't there before, was a culture of engaging with vendors. Right? And you not only learn a lot from the vendors, but also they can provide things that you don't necessarily want to do yourself. And so having that healthy mix of vendor-supported services and internally developed services is very, very important. In fact, actually going back to the point about sort of outsourcing or sort of contracting a technical capacity, one of the things that's really interesting is that there's a model now where a company might spend X, say, on engineering, but 8X on vendors around that. And so managing that is just as important as managing the engineers. And again, that's a professional capacity that's hard to develop and grow in-house.
To wrap things up, I have one more question. What is the best piece of advice that you've received throughout your journey and that you still carry on with you today?
So I was having a conversation with a colleague, and he was asking me about sort of whether it's important to read technology trends. He was reading a book. And I think what came to me really was, it's really about connections to people. And so I was saying 2 years ago, I started reaching out to vendors, but I also started reaching out to various other people. I had a young startup come to me just basically in my front door. This woman, Sheer, who runs a startup called Globe Thrivers. They are in the travel space. Startups in the travel space have a very hard time. And so I I was interested in her. And so I started informing her, advising her informally. And she was scheduled to speak at a conference in Vegas this summer, and wasn't able to go because she just had a baby. Congratulations, Sheer.
Congratulations.
But so I went to speak. I said, I'll fly myself out to Vegas and speak for you. And it was a great conference, a Virtuoso travel tech conference. And I met the founder that I'm working with now there, and he had gone to the conference looking for somebody who knew both technology and travel to help him build out this company. And so I think the message is that, yes, technology is great, but in a lot of ways, I think of the connections to people and understanding what they're doing and just spending time with people, sort of like dipping your fingers into a river, right? The more water flows across, the more you're likely to encounter a fish. And it's not just the encountering, but also saying, hey, does this kind of opportunity look like something that, it's a risk. Everything's a risk. Obviously, taking a job is the easy thing to do, and you know what the pay is, you know what the thing is, and
it's
that's
the
fine.
Safe space.
But then I think at any point in your career, especially if you're given the luxury of some time and financially you can sort of you can take your time to do this. There's so many things going on right now that it would be, for me in my role, given I just sort of exited from working full time for a public company for many years, not to take stock and to try something a little bit more risky. And because, look, if it doesn't pay off, it doesn't pay off, and that's not the end of the world. But if it does, like being the first, one of the first 10 people at a Booking.com versus...
It it pays off very well
Yeah.
on the long term.
So I think going to your point about advice, I think as much time as you can spend getting to know people, getting to understand what they're trying to do, how they're solving problems with business and engineering. As I said earlier, I think that I do think we are in really one of the seminal times in engineering. And we're seeing some of the effects right now, but when my boss at the time, Matt Goldberg at Trip, said, "Hey, how can we save 10% or 15% or 20% of our engineering costs by using AI?" A message to him was, well, we can't yet because it's not ready. But I think in the back of my mind, I knew that within 5 years, either you're going to expand capacity because you can, or yes, there are a lot of things that you're doing that you're not going to need to know now. That's just going to accelerate.
Yeah.
What the maybe not so hidden secret, certainly in the engineering community, we understand is that the LLMs are just as good at writing code as they are at writing language. And it's not that they're going to be able to sort of take a system and sort of figure out all the connections, but even more and more. I just met a founder of a company called SmartBlocks, a very, very cool company that you've heard of them?
SmartBlocks.
Yes. The startup, they're basically a pretty well funded, I think they're getting good traction, but they're a no kind of low code, no code, visual code. But the idea is that for systems that have well-defined APIs, you can sort of put them together and sort of build. I think their target right now is sort of back office, back end systems. And in fact, actually, I wish that they were around 3 years ago when I was building my crazy mess of spreadsheets. By the way, Google Sheets is still magic. I still love it. I was able to do incredible things with it. But it's not necessarily stable and not a great kind of a long-term solution. Something like a Superblocks would have been fantastic.
Yeah.
Now imagine sort of the Superblocks and the Vercel with AI connectors. All of a sudden, like everything can be a API. Everything can be a paradigm for connecting. And so I really think that the future of engineering is more aligned to integration and connections and data than it will be in kind of the more of the code model that we've sort of grown up with, right?
Yeah.
I kind of look at the trends, the macro trends in terms of what I've seen, right? The sort of the PC revolution, and then the cloud revolution, and then the app revolution, and now we have the AI revolution, and it is maybe bigger than all of them, and we're just getting started. You look at the models, how they're progressing year to year.
How fast they're evolving as well.
5 years, it's going to be crazy. Yeah. And so I think there's a wake-up call. In fact, I think I said that to my team, right? That as you're working in your job, you have to ask yourself, what's not just strategic, but business value? What networking value? And I don't mean networking in the sense of literal, technology networking, communication networking, but networking with people and systems, right? Yeah. That's the value of engineering down the road. And of course, there's always going to be people who are involved in building those APIs and that kind of stuff. But those jobs are going to shrink, right? And they'll be focused on a core set of skills. There'll be a lot more people working to sort of integrate those systems and so I think as an engineer, if you're looking at sort of the beginning of your career, the more you can sort of align yourself to how you're generating value. If it's not on the pure technology side, because there's both, but you have to do one or the other. You can't sit in the middle and sort of be complacent about, I'm able to code, no, that's not it. It's got to be about how you add value, and so I think that's the message of the time.
Thank you, Bob. That's some great advice.
Sure.
Well, I think with that we're at time.
Good.
So thank you everyone for watching, for tuning in. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And as always, keep on exploring, keep on learning, and keep on sharing. Thank you.
Awesome.
Great. That was so good.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, that was very insightful for me, but as well that, I think it was a really good flow.
Good. Oh, I can't wait to see it.